Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 600, the 600th episode. What can I say? I'm not much for creative names. Welcome to episode 600. As per usual, every 100 episodes we're going to do a little Q&A. This time I took questions from supporters on Patreon. I get too many otherwise, to be frank, these days. And while I am not always the best about rewarding the people who very generously give me a bit of extra money for not that much in return, this felt like a pretty obvious way to go about it. So, to my beloved patrons, I cannot say enough how much I appreciate you all. It is amazing, and also a little bit depressing, to realize that because of you, I have better access to resources for Japanese history in terms of secondary sources than I did when I was actually in graduate school. You are all amazing. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart. As a side note, one of the most common questions I get, both on Patreon and other platforms, is about graduate school. What it's like, who should do it, that sort of thing. I want to answer these, but I've been out of the game when it comes to academia for a little while now. But fortunately, I am planning an episode with a listener and friend with more recent experience. Together, we're going to do our best to talk you through things. So if you sent me a question like that, just know that it is coming soon. With no further ado, let's get into it. From patron Sarah, how would you recommend learning Japanese? Is there a better way than just brute forcing it through memorization? So I get this question a lot, and I think it's a great question. Japanese is a really fun language, and just generally I encourage anyone with interest in a foreign language to learn it. I think it's a really cool way to broaden your horizons and develop new ways to think about how we communicate. As for any shortcuts on learning, the short version is I don't really have any. I'm assuming here that any potential listeners are coming from either a Germanic or Romance language written in the Latin alphabet, and the unfortunate reality is that Japanese has two pretty crucial differences from those language families. First, Japanese is an SOV, subject-object-verb language in terms of ordering, where to my understanding at least, Germanic and Romance languages, at least English and Italian, the ones I'm most familiar with, are subject-verb-object. Chinese is actually closer to English grammar in that regard. The second big difference is, of course, ideographs, in other words, kanji, and of course that's a problem if you're learning both Japanese and Chinese. In college, I remember being fiendishly jealous of my friends taking Korean, who just had to spend about a month on the entirely phonetic Hangul alphabet before they could read a newspaper. The good news is that for Japanese, you need fewer characters than Chinese. The Ministry of Education has designated 2,136 joyo, or daily use kanji, that anyone who is educated should know. But in my experience, once you get past the first 500, you can usually get by. By comparison, in China, basic literacy, to my understanding, is about 1,500 characters, and for a job or higher education, depending on who you ask, you need somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000. I'm afraid that when I was learning characters, and this really is the biggest hurdle, I just did it through brute force. I found the best way to do it was just to make it a part of my daily routine. For me, my routine was, around the end of the day, like 4:35-ish, I would spend about 20 minutes just practicing new characters, writing them over and over and over to get them down. These days, I generally try to spend that time reading a newspaper article in Japanese, though I'm not as consistent as I would like to be. Meanwhile, of course, there's your listening and speaking skills, and of course your best option there, God help us all, is to actually talk to somebody. Failing that, I try to practice using media. I've been slowly working through the newest Assassin's Creed, for example, in Japanese, and that's been pretty fun. I replayed Persona 5 on a trip once entirely in Japanese. The best thing, of course, is to just go to Japan and live there. If you're in college, this is my shout out to the Hokkaido International Foundation, one of the best language programs I've ever done. It's over the summer. Hakodate is gorgeous during the summer. Hokkaido is amazing. All that said, though, this probably sounds a little discouraging, but I don't want it to be. Because here's the thing. Mastering another language, which I think is the goal people tend to go in with, is a tall order, and unless you were raised bilingual from birth, I frankly do not think you will accomplish it. I definitely haven't. I can get by okay in Japanese, for sure, The last 2 times I was there, I got dragged into one conversation about my master's thesis, because the person checking our passports was from Hagi in the old Choshu domain, and we got to talking about my work on a famous local figure, Yoshida Shoin, until my wife interrupted because she thought I was being detained, and then a separate conversation with someone who found out I was Jewish and wanted to tell me all about how he was convinced that the Japanese were actually the lost tribes of Israel. That was a great one to bust out the old "sa ne" quite a bit for. I definitely could not have gotten where I am without a lot of practice, but I am not fluent. You have no idea, when I try to read a poem in Japanese for this show, how many cuts are interrupted by me stumbling and then saying some very bad words I can't include in the final cut without falling afoul of the Apple Podcasts clean label. I don't think, though, that mastery should be anyone's goal. As a Japanese friend of mine once reminded me, she has to use a dictionary too sometimes, and she would never say she doesn't speak Japanese. Set more concrete goals for yourself. Maybe that's the ability to read a manga you like in the original. I actually recommend that a lot. Manga is great because the characters tend to be easier. Maybe it's listening to a show in Japanese while relying as little as you can on subtitles. Maybe it's reading a short story. I'm a big fan of Yoshimoto Banana if you want someone who's not Murakami Haruki. The point is, try things. You will have a hard time. It is okay. Keep trying. Your only opponent, as the saying goes, is yourself from yesterday. Try to be just a little bit better than you were every single day. You'll have no idea how far that can take you. So, from patron TM, have you encountered any data during your project that really shattered your preconceptions in a major way? Things along the lines of, I didn't realize all shoguns are bastards, merchants were much more important than I realized, why did I ever fall for the Japan was sealed off business, stuff like that. I love this question. It's a great one, but it's really hard because I have so many at this point. My understanding of Japanese history is, well, always better than it was, because every day, thanks to the podcast, I'm reading something new or going back to something old with new context and knowledge. That's just the joy of learning. To give one very recent example, reading Koumei's World for those episodes, and initially I just wanted to do 2 actually, one pre and one post restoration. We can see how that worked out. I was so struck by how Koumei describes the religious movements, I guess you'd say, that broke out during the cholera epidemic of 1858, and again when Eijanaika made its way to Wakayama in 1867. On the one hand, the things she was describing were just so odd from a modern frame of reference, but on the other, I kept thinking about how a lot of our own reactions to, say, COVID seem pretty weird out of context. Y'all remember the Primal Scream days? I remember the Primal Scream days. Similarly, learning just how commercial Utagawa Hiroshige's work was really struck me. It felt like a very modern way to think about art as a commodity, even in relation to someone who usually gets a treatment focused just on their aesthetics. Meanwhile, to give an example from my academic career very early on, so early that I don't quite remember what book this was from, I think it was Eiko Ikegami's The Taming of the Samurai, but I could be wrong. I think it was Ikegami who made a sort of offhand point in her book about how we radically misinterpret all the injunctions you see in feudal texts toward the samurai about being loyal to your lord, honorable, all that stuff. You often see that interpreted as meaning those were the values of the samurai class. That's the sort of textbook standard definition. But Ikegami made a very interesting point that stuck with me a lot. If anything, we should have the opposite interpretation. Those constant reminders to be loyal wouldn't be necessary if people were, actually doing that. And that was a very early mind-blown moment for me from, I think it was late in undergrad? God, longer than I want to think about. It's still something I bring up every time I teach the history of the samurai. One memory I can place much better is one of the best classes I ever took in graduate school with my mentor, Dr. Kenneth Pyle, who did a semester-long elective on the atomic bombs. And I remember starting off that class very firmly of the moral conviction that using the bombs was wrong, and ending the class much more conflicted than I had been. The whole thing simply involved reading famous works on the subject, and in the process being exposed to good arguments for both what we'd call a traditionalist approach to the bomb, people arguing the bomb did help end World War II, and revisionist ones that it in some way did not. I'm still generally more sympathetic to the revisionist arguments. If nothing else, spending $2 billion in 1945 currency on something that maybe worked is not really a great vibe, independent of all of the separate moral questions. But the class and talking to my classmates about the material really made me challenge my preconceptions and be more open to their ideas and to the idea that morality in warfare was not as black and white as at the time I thought it was. It was a really good class for forcing me to challenge my own biases and assumptions, and for practicing being critical of arguments I disagreed with, without criticizing the people making those arguments or treating the disagreement itself as some sort of moral failing. Basically, I think there's no subject where returning to it won't constantly force you to reevaluate your position, or you won't be having new aha moments. That's kind of the whole point of trying to learn in the first place. Now here is a second real banger of a question, again from TM. Have there been any metaphorical earthquakes in Japanese historiography in recent decades, things along the magnitude of in recent Western historiography, feudalism didn't exist, or thesis, the Roman Empire did not fall? So, first things first, for those of us who are less deep in the paint on academia, yes, if you haven't heard, both feudalism didn't exist and the Roman Empire didn't fall are arguments you do see advanced in academia today. A lot of that has to do with the incentive structure academia tends to produce, which really rewards novel approaches that try to distinguish themselves from the existing scholarship on a given subject. Basically, as an academic, the way you are trained to think about these things is that your work is always responding to previous books, articles, whatnot on the same subject. That's why a lot of academic books or papers start with what you either call a historiographical overview or a literature overview that talks through what previously has been said. And fundamentally, here's what the previous work missed, or here is what they were wrong about, is a much more exciting claim to follow that literature review, a more novel approach than, yeah, basically those people were all right and I'm just adding some extra evidence to the pile. So there is an incentive to always be looking for a fresh angle on things, but it's also worth noting that the two framings I just gave you are pretty sensationalized and shortened ones of the actual arguments that you see advanced in academia. Nobody is going around claiming, that I'm aware of at least, that the Roman emperors secretly stuck around in the West after 476, or that knights and kings and all that stuff aren't real. Well, except for those right-wing crazy Russian conspiracists who believe the Middle Ages were made up to make Russia look bad, but that's a whole other can of worms. The actual arguments are closer to feudalism has a bajillion different loaded meanings, from the three estate system to vassalage contracts to a collection of aesthetics that's loosely Lord of the Rings-y, and there's no real single idea that encompasses all those different things. Similarly, nobody claims that the end of the Roman Empire in the West didn't happen. It's more like the aftermath of the collapse was less disruptive than you think, and there are more continuities from before and after the fall of the empire, including, the whole Eastern Roman Empire, than there are differences. So in that sense, with that prefacing, yes, absolutely, there were some big ones in the time I was in academia. There probably have been a lot more since I got more out of the game. I don't quite track the latest hot debates like I used to, so anybody who's currently in academia probably has some quality tea from the freshest of fresh takes that I do not. But, just to name some from back in my day, the head of my PhD committee, Dr. Ken Pyle, he was a big fan of the post-war Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru. Basically, when he taught us post-war history, he gave Yoshida credit for constructing the post-war system that dominated Japan to the 1990s. My recollection was that this was largely because of his mentor, Dr. Marius Jansen, who sharp-eyed listeners will probably recognize because his monumental The Making of Modern Japan is still one of the most detailed volumes in the history of the country since 1600 there is. I reference it constantly, and there's a lot to go over because it's over 1,100 pages long. Jansen was also a big Yoshida fan. But since grad school, I've read more on post-war history, and I have soured a bit on Yoshida as a figure, primarily because of the work of Nick Kapoor, who I think makes a great case that it was really Ikeda Hayato who architected the post-war Japanese order after 1960. Dr. Pyle, I remember, introduced Ikeda to his students mostly as a student of Yoshida who carried his ideas forward, but I really think, I am convinced by Dr. Kapoor, Ikeda deserves the lion's share, if not, all the credit, for the actual arrangement that made Japan into an economic titan of the late 20th century, which might not seem like a huge claim compared to the Middle Ages were fake or whatever, but given that the driving goal of basically everyone to the right of the Communist Party in Japan has been to try to bring back the good times of the late 20th century, why those happened is, pretty loaded and a very important subject to a lot of people. Another slightly more exciting claim I think would qualify, though it's a bit different from the others, is the claim that the Sengoku period, the civil wars of the 1400s and 1500s, are also not real in the sense we think of them. You see, the dominant image of this period is one of near constant warfare and instability, but if you actually look at records, particularly from the period before the rise of the three unifiers from 1560-ish on, what you see is less constant warfare and more occasional fighting and a central government that can't do much about it. You very much don't see something like contemporary Europe, where the wars of religion were really just starting in the 1500s, culminating, of course, in the horrific destruction of the 30 Years' War, which killed or displaced about a third of the population of what's now Germany, and bore the dubious distinction of being the only war in European history that killed more civilians and soldiers, all the way until World War II happened. The Sengoku period was not like this at all, from what we can tell. Which of course made sense since it was not an ideological conflict in the same way. I think the phrase civil war, which we tend to use and does technically fit the Sengoku period, conjures a level of violence today that's not quite accurate, at least for most of this period, and that's not really helped by modern media portrayals which tend to emphasize the violence of it all. And of course, I am not claiming there was no violence during this period, in the same way that modern revisionist scholars of feudalism or the collapse of Western Rome are not trying to make the most absurd possible readings of their arguments. What I'm saying is that the violence was more on and off, quick low-level wars between clans, and generally targeted other warrior families. You don't see the same sort of total war approach of, say, burning down a village to deny your enemy supplies. At least, not right away. It's only from about 1560 on, under Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, that the violence really starts to pick up a new level, particularly against non-samurai bases of power, like temples or the various Ikki leagues that dominated some of the provinces. In other words, it's not like nothing interesting happened before Nobunaga, but there is a reason why the most popular stories and the most sensationalized stories from this time happen in the last 40-ish years of it. And of course, I really want to emphasize there probably are other examples out there. I don't follow the latest and greatest news in academia as much as I used to. I read a lot more widely than I did when I was in graduate school, which is awesome because frankly, I think I have a much more complete knowledge of Japanese history than most people who go through graduate history programs would. You are encouraged to hyper-specialize in academia, and outside your niche, you really don't need more than the basics to teach an occasional intro class. So being able to go deep on a variety of subjects instead of extremely deep on just one is a privilege, but it means I'm also not quite as on top of things in my field as I used to be. So, from patron Dan B, I'd love to hear more about people like Philipp Franz von Siebold, who spent some time in Japan early in the 19th century as Tokugawa control was starting to fray. He seems to have really appreciated the culture, but all I know about him comes from the museum based on his collection in Leiden. So I did an episode about 1 billion years ago, episode 248, which my website tells me came out in July 2018, on the Siebold family, but it's been a hot minute, and they are a subject I want to return to. This is actually a thing I've talked about before. There are a lot of fresh topics to take on that I'd never done before, but also some older ones I think I could do a better job on now, since I just know more and also have far more resources to make use of. Thank you very much, beloved patrons. As for the Siebold family, I have a deep soft spot for him and for the other two people I think of as the combined trinity of Europeans who documented Japan during this period, Engelbert Kempfer and my personal favorite, largely for the name, Isaac Titsing. Siebold in particular really interests me because he was forced out of Japan in 1829 for possessing maps of Hokkaido, which led to suspicion he was a Russian spy. But he lived until 1866, so he did see Japan get reopened, and if memory serves, even met with a few members of the Perry expedition before it left for Edo in 1853 to offer Commodore Perry advice. Siebold is of course also really interesting because he left a child behind, a half-Japanese girl who would go on to be one of the first Western doctors in Japan, Kusumoto Ine. Her story is also really fascinating. So at some point I do want to return to them, but I don't think I can really do more justice than that in a short question like this. From patron George, how much of your research do you do in written Japanese sources, and are most older and ancient sources now digitized and converted to typeset Japanese, not in cursive anymore? The short answer is, it depends. I feel like one of you at this point should make a drinking game every time I say the short answer is it depends. Everyone do a shot of shochu. Actually, don't do that. I don't want any of you to get alcohol poisoning. Anyway, it's very dependent on the topic. For most, I have to do some research in Japanese, whether it's rooting around online to find an image for the show notes or double-checking a date because I suspect an author got something wrong. This happens a lot more than you would think. Most academically published books, in my experience, have at least one typo with the wrong month or year or something like that. On the extreme end, for example, the episode on the Black Mist scandal in Japan Pro Baseball is one where I did basically all the research in Japanese from the jump because there's just not that much, at least that I know of, on the history of Japanese pro baseball in English. Maybe I'm wrong about that. If I am, someone let me know. That one took a lot longer than usual as a result. Another one I remember taking a while on was the Japanese soldiers who remained in Vietnam and supported the Viet Minh after 1945. In English, there's almost no academic work on the subject, at least none when I was doing the episode that I could find, so I was totally reliant on Japanese sources. To give another example, doing the overview episodes from episode 501 to 540, all the references to classical histories like the Azuma Kagami, Kojiki, Nihon Shoki, all that stuff, were tracked down in the original Japanese via the fantastic Japanese Historical Text Initiative. For example, I would search through their database of digitized texts to find references to people, places, all that stuff. Fortunately, I can still read Japanese decently even though my spoken Japanese has gotten a lot weaker, so I can manage okay. However, I try not to go too hard into Japanese sources unless I absolutely have to for one main reason. As you'll see if you check the show notes, I usually try to give at least 2, if not more, sources for each episode, where if you want to read more or see where I got my info from, you can check them out. My hope is for the podcast to be accessible even if you don't speak Japanese and haven't been to Japan, so I try to offer sources in English as much as possible, since if you're listening to this podcast, presumably you are at least familiar with English. It's very much my belief that while you do need Japanese to study Japanese history academically, you don't need language skills to be an interested non-expert, and that's my main target audience for the podcast. So in the show notes, I want to be able to leave things for you all that you can use to follow up with anything you're interested in, even if you don't speak the language. As for digitization, the shorter answer is it depends. Things are better than they were, to my understanding. Obviously, I don't delve as much into archives as I used to way back in the day, but even when I was working on my ill-fated dissertation, I remember a good amount of sources being available via what's called JACAR, the Japan Center for Asian Historical Records, which combines sources from the Foreign Ministry, the Self-Defense Forces, and the National Archives, among others. My general experience was that the digitization process for sources was behind where, say, the Library of Congress is with ones related to American history. And in general, Japanese archive culture, so to speak, is a lot more old school. There are still quite a few archives where digital services are not readily available beyond a very basic catalog, if that, and quite a few where you can't even get in if you don't have a recommendation letter. Things have probably improved since the olden days of the mid-2010s. It has been about a decade, God help me. But generally, archives can be tricky to access unless you have some kind of in already anyway. But I can't complain too much. I had a colleague in grad school doing academic research in China where state control of archival resources and blocking of impolitic research was kind of a matter of course, and I had one colleague who focused mainly on North Korea, so by comparison, I felt like I always had it pretty easy. From patron Alberto, my impression is that minifigures from the Heian period are a bit fuzzy and we don't have so many details about them. I would love for you to highlight one person from this period that gives you the vibe of the times. I read this question and immediately thought, oh, this'll be easy. Then I realized I had to pick one person, and it became much, much harder, but it's my podcast, so in the time-honored tradition, I'm just gonna cheat and pick two. But in fairness, one of these barely counts because I talk about her every time the Heian period comes up. She is, of course, my queen, my goat, Sei Shonagon, one of my favorite figures from this period and really all of Japanese history. I have talked about her so much, most recently in the episode I did with Dr. Freyling on his translation of Hyakunin Isshu. She is everything I love about writing from the Heian period, about the Japanese literary tradition, all of it. The Pillow Book, her most famous piece of writing, is hard to do justice to here. I guess I'd call it comedic, biting observations about the world combined with some moments of just literary flair. It was basically an excuse for her to show off what a good writer she was, and in that sense, a wild success. Anyway, I love Sei Shonagon. We should all love Sei Shonagon. My other pick might be a bit more surprising. Abe no Seimei. Now, we have not talked about him much on the show, which is why I want to give him some credit here. I did an episode on him a long time ago, like within the first year I was doing the podcast, but it has been, again, a long time. So Abe no Seimei is what's called an onmyoji. Onmyo, in this instance, is a direct translation of the Chinese characters for yin and yang, though my inner pedant feels compelled to note that the Y sound in the first case is much softer than most Westerners tend to make it. It should be yin and yang. Anyway, Abe no Seimei was, in other words, a diviner trained in the Chinese tradition that goes all the way back to the I Ching, whose job it was to be a sort of advisor to the emperors on basically everything. I love Abe no Seimei as a figure for a couple reasons. First, he was a big presence at the imperial court during the 900s, which is a period of really high political drama, where you see this brutal competition for power between the imperial family, the aristocratic Fujiwara clan, and all the other big power holders in Kyoto. It's just generally, for lack of more definite language, a very Game of Thrones-ish period in Japanese history. Lots of alliances, backbiting, betrayal, all that fun stuff, and Abe no Seimei was present for all of it. Abe was trusted by several of the emperors, and for example was supposedly able to cure the Emperor Ichijo of a very serious illness by virtue of his prayers and spells. He also became a close confidant of Fujiwara no Michinaga, who was pretty much the guy of the Fujiwara family, arguably the most powerful figure in the whole country. Abe no Seimei is also one of those figures who has a vast compilation of stories accrued around him, which can be frustrating because it's hard to sort truth from fiction, but of course that can also be fun. Those legends, often accrued in later supernatural tales, are just very pulpy. They involve him unmasking demons in the midst of society, or pulling one over on his foes at court using magic. But what I find most fascinating about Abe no Seimei, and generally anyone who claims access to that kind of supernatural power, divining the future, all that stuff, is what exactly they thought they were doing. I, a cynically empirical-minded child of modernity, of course operate from the assumption that the supernatural is not real, because there is no empirical scientific evidence for it. And this really makes me wonder, was Abe no Seimei a con artist who knew he didn't have magic powers but convinced people he did? Did he believe his own lines? How much of my assumptions that he had to be faking it come from my assumptions, which are not appropriate for thinking about 10th century Japan? It's a fun question to consider. In conclusion, somebody make a TV show about Abe no Seimei. It would be cool. Please hire me as a consultant. From patron Bert, I would love to hear more about the modern practice of Shinto, how central it is to daily life, is it comparable to Christianity or Judaism in the US in that regard? If not, what's the history of the Zaibatsu, and which one owns Nintendo? I actually like both these questions, so I'm going to do them both, but the first one is challenging for me, of course, because, shockingly, I am not Japanese. Again, if you need a moment to process this, I understand. As such, my relationship to Shinto is very different from someone for whom that is their heritage or part of their daily life. What I will say is that Shinto has a very tangled relationship to the concept of religion, and that shapes how it's practiced day to day in Japan. For most of its history, Shinto wasn't really an organized religion in the way we think of that term. The concept of organized religion has a very specific history that's bound up primarily with the Abrahamic religions and especially Christianity. Especially the notion of a belief system with a coherent theology that is internally consistent and which deals primarily with matters of personal faith. Shinto doesn't really fit this at all. For most of its history, it's a very amorphous practice with no real defined theology beyond a broad notion that the kami, the spirits of the world, were powerful, and generally one should keep them happy. There were the occasional attempts to assert more uniformity among shrines, even license and grade shrine priests to ensure some basic standards, but the people responsible for doing that, the aristocratic families of Kyoto's court and the emperor, had no enforcement mechanisms to maintain compliance. What were they going to do, send a strongly worded poem? The word Shinto, which itself comes from the characters meaning way of the kami, didn't even become a standard way to refer to the belief system until much, much later. And it's not really until the early Meiji years in the 1870s, after the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate, that you see the first attempts to really standardize Shinto as a religion. The Meiji leadership believed Japan needed a state religion, didn't really like Buddhism as that state religion because it was a foreign faith that was perceived as not really Japanese and had been favored by the previous Tokugawa regime, and after all, the emperor's divine right to rule was predicated on Shinto mythology. In addition, many leaders of the Meiji state felt that Japan needed some sort of analog to Christianity in the West as a spiritual tentpole of the state to rally the people around the regime. Up to World War II, the imperial government tried a lot of policies to promote Shinto as a state religion for these exact reasons, even as their lawyers claimed this was not what they were doing. You see, both Japan's old 1889 constitution, which was in place under the Empire, and the 1947 constitution imposed by the US after World War II, contain guarantees of religious freedom. The 1947 ones are stronger, of course, but both documents make it clear that religious practices are up to individual people, which makes it hard to compel people to engage with a national religion. Why those rights are included is a bit complicated, but the upshot is the government got around this by declaring that Shinto was not a religion. It was a Japanese cultural practice akin to, like, the tea ceremony. Cultural practices, of course, can be compulsory, and thus in pre-war Japan it was very easy to, for example, compel students to visit a shrine as a part of school. Even after World War II, that logic remained in place. There's a famous Supreme Court case from the 80s where the Supreme Court upheld the enshrinement in Yasukuni Shrine, the place where you're enshrined if you die in uniform serving Japan, of a serviceman who died in the SDF after an accident. His wife, a Japanese Christian, had objected to the practice on the grounds that it was against her religion. The court answered this was a cultural practice, so religious freedom was not an issue. Less dramatic, today you will see shrines in places of business, office parks. I've never attended a primary or secondary school in Japan, but my understanding is that trips to shrines are not uncommon. Students are not obligated to pray, but faculty do, and students are not prevented from doing so. I can't imagine doing that, for example, with a trip to a church and having faculty pray in front of students, though I'd never have worked at like an explicitly religious school. Anyway, this gets at the weird nature of Shinto as a religion, specifically because it doesn't have a strict theology, so it's easier to see it as a cultural practice, a sort of why not, compared to the more stringent forms of Buddhism like, say, Nichiren, or the new religions, or of course Christianity, which are much more explicitly traditional religions as we understand that term in the West. As for the Zaibatsu, well, here's the thing, there are no more Zaibatsu, sort of. The short answer is, it's complicated. The slightly longer version is that before World War II, the Zaibatsu were mega corporations that revolved around a specific family, which would then buy up a bunch of subsidiary corporations they would control using an overall holding corporation. That's pretty abstract, so let's make it more specific. Let's take Mitsubishi, the Zaibatsu founded by Iwasaki Yataro, a former samurai of Tosa Domain. Iwasaki got his start in shipping, buying up, among other things, the former merchant marine of his home domain after the abolition of feudalism. The money he made on shipping he invested in everything from steel manufacturing to real estate. These subsidiary businesses were all owned by a Mitsubishi holding company, a company whose job was to invest money in the other Mitsubishi businesses in exchange for ownership stakes in them. Iwasaki, in turn, owned the holding company, and when he died, controlled of the holding company, and thus the whole damn enterprise went to his heirs. This arrangement made the Zaibatsu extremely economically powerful, and while the relationship between the Zaibatsu and the pre-1945 military government in Japan was not always cozy, a lot of Japanese fascists hated the Zaibatsu, which they saw as symptomatic of the greed created by Western capitalism, the Zaibatsu were still important enough to the war effort that the Americans who rolled into Tokyo after 1945 made destroying them a priority. One of the leaders of that program was Eleanor Hadley, a native of some dinky town called Seattle, who specialized in economics and international affairs in school, had studied at Tokyo Imperial University before World War II, and was now working for the State Department while also finishing her doctorate at Radcliffe College, an all-women's school that was eventually folded into Harvard. Hadley pushed for a very aggressive approach to the Zaibatsu, drafting laws that banned the old family-owned Zaibatsu holding companies and strengthening Japan's fair trade and anti-monopoly laws. Unfortunately, starting in 1947, her career in Japan very rapidly imploded. As the Cold War started to take shape, American leaders were suddenly less worried about democratizing the economy than they were about making sure Japan was stable as a Cold War ally, and so the anti-Zaibatsu campaign, intended to deconcentrate economic power, was scrapped in favor of just getting the Japanese economy functional again. Hadley, meanwhile, was accused by Major General Charles Willoughby, one of the senior leaders of the American occupation, of being a communist sympathizer. There was no evidence for that occupation, and Willoughby was kind of a notorious piece of garbage. He protected several Japanese war criminals from prosecution, and participated in a plot to assassinate a prime minister, Yoshida Shigeru, he felt was insufficiently anti-communist, so this is not that shocking coming from him. Still, this was the McCarthy era in the US, and so the accusation that Hadley was a communist ended up tanking her career, though she would end up with a nice teaching gig at the University of Washington, so good for her. More importantly for the course of Japanese history, it meant the Zaibatsu were never fully dismantled. The old Zaibatsu families found a way around the new laws, a system that is now called the Keiretsu. The Keiretsu of today are simply put looser Zaibatsu. The main differentiating feature is that they are centered around not a holding company, those are illegal, but a bank that invests in subsidiary companies to exert influence over them. So for example, there's no more Mitsubishi Holding Company, but there is the Mitsubishi UFJ Bank, which is the heart of today's Mitsubishi Keiretsu. However, banks are also much more tightly regulated than just a company that owns another company, and so there are limits on the power and control they can exert. They can't quite dictate policy in the same way that being a shareholder in a regular publicly traded company can make you influential, but you can't dictate policy day to day. The banks can facilitate relationships between the companies and their networks, making sure they don't compete directly, that they work together to bulk source raw materials or find distributors, that sort of thing, but they don't fully call the shots in the same way the pre-World War II Zaibatsu did. The modern Keiretsu relationships are actually loose enough that there have been attempts, of course, to argue that they are not real, dovetailing nicely, of course, with one of our earlier questions. In this way of thinking, the term Keiretsu was coined by Japanese economic historians who happened to all be Marxists in the 60s, in order to argue that the 1945 reforms of the American occupation had not meaningfully changed the old system of Japan, which was still fundamentally exploitative and thus deserved to be overthrown in a Marxist revolution. I don't know if I'd entirely agree with the Keiretsu were made up by Marxists to justify the revolution, but they're less important than the Zaibatsu were for sure, and one of the ways you can tell is that there are very successful, huge businesses in Japan that are not owned by Keiretsu, and are still extremely influential big movers and shakers in the economy. One of these, founded by the audio engineer Morita Akio, is Sony, which operates in a wide number of tech fields but doesn't have the same structure around an investment bank. Another is Nintendo. Fun fact, the only long-term job I ever held that wasn't in education was at Nintendo of America. I was terrible at it. Nintendo has no corporate master. It is publicly traded, but it is not part of a keiretsu system. So this is a great example of how, while Japan's economy certainly is not perfect, it is a much more even playing field than it was before 1945. So that brings us to the end of our questions. There were a few more, but I think those ones are deep enough that I actually need whole episodes on them. One more time, thank you all very much for listening. It has now been over 10 years by a pretty wide margin of doing this podcast, and that is crazy to think about. Every day I'm grateful for the opportunities it's brought me. I've met some really wonderful people. I've received some really wonderful messages from you all. Even if I never respond, I can't say enough. They really mean a lot. And of course, especially my patrons, you give to me very generously. I can't say enough what it means, just the confidence, the kind of vote of belief in the show that shows. So, one more time, thank you all very much for listening, and I'll see you all next week.